So my dad and my sister were prepping me for that conversation to go in and be able to answer, my name and my age and my grade and where I came from, like basic conversation stuff. And this way she would not, object to the idea of having this kid that needs all of this remediation work in her classroom. So, and in those 2 weeks, I was ready and practiced the whole thing. I know how to answer, give my name and my age and basic conversation with the teacher. And I was going into the classroom ready to have that conversation. There was, no problem whatsoever. Okay. So as soon as I walk in and she calls my name and calls me to her desk, and then she looks at me straight in the eye and starts to asking me, "What's your name? Where are you from?" And I froze. I started. I knew all the answers, but I was like, I'm not going to lie to this lady. This is a very serious situation. So I started speaking to her in Arabic. I told her, listen, I'm sorry. I know how to answer. I know exactly what you're asking me, and I can, fool you and give you the answers, the prepackaged answers that I memorized. But let me tell you the situation. I know nothing.
Welcome to Activist MMT, a podcast about nonviolent MMT direct activism, introducing modern monetary theory to the world and conversations about learning MMT together. I'm your host, Jeff Epstein. Today I talk with Fadhel Kaboub about his personal story. His childhood in Saudi Arabia and Tunisia, being a parent, his love of music, and how music has become part of his parenting. Fadhel is an economics professor at Denison University in Granville, Ohio, and the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, an interdisciplinary public policy think tank. The focus of his academic work is on how the lens of MMT can inform developing nations, which we talk about in the second half of part 2. I've written a post filled with links to Fadhel's papers, posts, and appearances, a link to which you can find in the show notes. Today's story begins with a 9-year-old Fadhel at the center of a political drama between his two home countries of Saudi Arabia and Tunisia. When his grandparents in Tunisia fell ill, his father rushed home from his job in Saudi Arabia to take care of them. Saudi Arabia's immigration laws require foreign workers to give their employers not only their own passport, but also the passports of all their children. Unfortunately, when Fadhel's father left for Tunisia, the employer decided not to release Fadhel's passport, essentially holding the 9-year-old hostage. His family leveraged the media to shame Saudi Arabia into allowing the little boy to be reunited with his family. To this day, Fadhel has never seen his original passport. We then turn to the story of how Fadhel joined the 5th grade in Tunisia with children who had a 3.5-year head start in learning French. This is the language spoken during half of the instruction time in the country. The overriding theme of Fadhel's story, however, is how there is no place on earth where he is not considered an outsider or immigrant. Babies born in Saudi Arabia are only considered citizens if their father is a Saudi citizen. Fadhel's mother was a citizen, but his father was Tunisian. When he moved to Tunisia, he had a Saudi accent and was unable to speak French. And now, even though a U.S. citizen, he remains an immigrant. The experience, plus witnessing the experience of his parents and home countries, has greatly influenced and inspired not only his academic work, but also his decisions as the parent of 3 little boys. This podcast, Activist MMT, is dedicated half to academic concepts and half to the personal stories of how people, both lay people and academics, came to MMT and how it changed them. The reason I believe these personal stories are so important is because it's not possible to separate the academic concepts from those who develop and promote them. This includes their personal stories, what they care about, and how they choose to use the power they have or don't have. The idea was primarily inspired by Fred Lee in his 2006 book, A History of Heterodox Economics, which was recommended to me by Nathan Tenkus. Neoclassical economics would have you focus only on their maths and models and not the discriminatory behavior of universities and journals, and those that back those universities, journals, and their economists. They would prefer you not look at any other discipline, such as history, culture, sociology, institutions, and especially politics. The entire neoliberal project would have you focus only on the how are you going to pay for it question, and not the minor inconvenience of having to change the very foundation of human society if we are not to go extinct in the coming decades. I talk much more about this concept of interdisciplinarity in my introduction to episode 81 with Richard Tye. But for now, on to my conversation with Fadhel Kaboub. This is part 1 of a 2-part conversation. Enjoy. You can contact me directly on Twitter or by emailing me at activistmmt@gmail.com. If you like this podcast, please consider becoming a monthly patron. Patrons get exclusive, super early access to nearly every episode, and they also get the opportunity to ask my academic guests questions. You can become a patron at patreon.com/activistmmt. Thank you to all my patrons for your continued faith and support, and thank you for becoming one if you can, and for sharing this around if you can't. Finally, I'm also developing a large collection of Learn MMT resources, which you can find at activistmmt.org. Thanks. Hello, Fadhel. It's so nice to see you. It's so nice to finally be talking to you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much for coming on and for doing this. I wanted to take this opportunity to try and do something different. You told some of your personal story on your Money on the Left podcast, but I was hoping that you would be willing to go a little more into your personal story. And the reason that I want to do this is I think creating the context for the academic concepts is really important. And the context and an important part of context is the people themselves and what they care about and, their personal story. So I'd like to spend much of this interview trying to get a little more of that personal story, if that's okay. But before we get started, can you please pronounce your own name?
Yes, absolutely. My name is Fadhel Kaboub.
Thank you. Okay. I hear multiple pronunciations and I've always wanted to hear you say that. Okay, excellent. All right. So Fadhel, you can briefly introduce yourself, but why don't we get right into the questions? And can you talk about your childhood and young adulthood in Saudi Arabia and Tunisia, and maybe some anecdotes that might illuminate, a little bit of who you are. So thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on the show. Again, my name is Fadhel Kaboub. I teach economics at Denison University in Ohio, and I run the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. To tell you a little bit about my background, I can give you maybe the short version, and then we can go into follow-up questions if you're interested.
Sure.
So as you mentioned, I grew up in the Middle East. I was born in Saudi Arabia and lived there for a while, went to school there even. My mother's side of the family is from Saudi Arabia and different parts of the region, the Middle East. My father's side of the family is from Tunisia and North Africa. So I went to school there for a few years, and then when I was 9, we had to move back to Tunisia for a number of reasons. And then I ended up finishing my education, middle school, high school in Tunisia, and I ended up going to college and studying economics also in Tunisia. And after that, I ended up going to grad school in Kansas City at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, which is where I started this journey on the MMT path, having studied there with everybody in the MMT community: Randy Ray, Matt Forstater, Stephanie Kelton, and everybody else who was either at UMKC as a faculty member, like Fred Lee, one of the giants of post-Keynesian economics, and people who ended up sort of becoming part of the UMKC family as visitors, as people who spent their sabbaticals or did their postdocs or just came to a lot of the conferences that were hosted at UMKC in the early 2000s, which is when I was in grad school there. And after UMKC, I ended up teaching sort of on a visiting position basis for a couple of years. I spent a year teaching at Simon's Rock College in Western Mass, which is part of Bard College. Ended up teaching for a year at Denison, actually, as a visitor, and then started my full-time teaching career as a tenure track position at Drew University in New Jersey, also another liberal arts college. And then finally in 2008, ended up coming back to Denison in Ohio on a full-time basis. And I've been here since then.
And actually, Fred Lee was most of my inspiration for the personal stories in the context. Is there, can you talk about some of the reason that your family moved from Saudi Arabia to Tunisia when you were 9?
Oh, sure. So as I mentioned, my father is Tunisian, so he was working in Saudi Arabia as an immigrant. And, if you know anything about Saudi Arabia's immigration laws, they're not very friendly to foreigners. So I'll give you an example. And things have changed a little bit since then. So at the time, this was in the 1980s, early 1980s. If you are a foreigner working in Saudi Arabia, as soon as you arrive in the country, your employer, your sponsor, is legally allowed, and maybe even mandated, I think, to take your passport and your family members, if they're with you, to take all their passports and to hold them, to keep them essentially with your employer. And you're only allowed to take your passports back if you're leaving the country with the approval of your sponsor, with their permission. So that's when they give you your passport back. So it really restricts your freedom in terms of when you can travel. You can imagine if a family situation emerges and somebody has to fly back home to care for their parents or somebody in the hospital, and your employer happens not to be in town or not to be available, and you don't have your passports, right? So it was not a kind of a situation that was easy to handle. Also, a lot of the laws were at the time written in a way that almost give excessive power to the employer, and courts typically side with the Saudi employers as opposed to the workers or the immigrants and so on. So there was a situation where my grandparents in Tunisia were sick, and my father had to rush and go there, and both of my parents ended up going, and I stayed in school with my grandparents, partly because it was school year, but partly because the employer at the time thought, well, we can sort of hold the kid hostage. So that, yeah, exactly. So my passport was kept hostage with his employer at the time. And you can imagine the tension that it created. So my parents ended up staying in Tunisia, hoping that my situation will be resolved and that my grandparents will be able to get my passports and send me back home. And this sort of developed into a little diplomatic crisis between Tunisia and Saudi Arabia.
Really?
Yeah, the story of the child,
9-year-old boy.
the 9-year-old boy who couldn't go back to his home country, which was Tunisia,
Wow.
and ended up in newspapers and ambassadors and consulates sending back and forth official diplomatic communications, and so it took a while for the situation to get resolved, because clearly my father wasn't going to be able to go back and work for the same employer, and without a sponsor, you can't go back and work for anybody else. So there was no going back for my father, essentially, after that situation.
Wow.
And I ended up actually missing quite a bit of the following academic year.
So 9-year-old, that was about like...
So I finished what would be in the Middle East, it will be called fourth grade in Saudi Arabia. And I was supposed to go into fifth grade.
Yeah.
So I couldn't go into fifth grade in Saudi Arabia because I had to go to private school as a non-citizen. And those were very expensive. And of course, our economic situation wasn't working well.
Why were you you were a non-citizen of Saudi Arabia because your parents moved out?
Oh, because in Saudi Arabia, to be a citizen, even though I was born there, the father had to be a Saudi citizen. It's not sufficient that you're born there and your mother is Saudi. Yeah, that's another thing about citizenship laws in Saudi Arabia. So I couldn't go to public schools, and we couldn't afford private school with my father being unemployed and the situation being the way it was. So I missed pretty much more than half the academic year for my fifth grade. And then eventually the situation ended up getting resolved, sort of. That is, I never actually got my passport back to this day, but I ended up traveling with like a diplomatic piece of paper that says you can travel without a passport. And I ended up going back to Tunisia in the middle of the academic year in a completely different academic environment. In Saudi Arabia, the language of instruction is Arabic. And, kids learn a little bit of English, like very elementary type of stuff. But in Tunisia, the academic system is a French post-colonial system. So French and Arabic are the two main languages. And I've never taken any French. And my classmates in fifth grade had already started taking French in second grade. So they have second, third, fourth grade, and half of the fifth grade year ahead of me in French. And it's like 50%.
Not to mention the academic concepts themselves.
Sure. And it's 50% of the instruction time in school is in French. So I was way behind. So my parents managed to convince the school to let me in the middle of the academic year, despite all the deficiencies I had. And they convinced the principal that if the French teacher could have me both in the fifth grade class with my classmates, but at the same time put me in the second grade class with the beginners so I can sort of play catch up in literally 3.5 months and try to, make it. The principal agreed to do this, but the teacher wasn't there at the time. She was she was on leave, medical leave. She had a surgery of some sort. So she was gone for 2 weeks when I started school in Tunisia. So it was kind of a relief. I didn't have to go straight into it. But then the clock was ticking.
You're reminding me of Nelson. If you watch The Simpsons, you watch The Simpsons at all?
Sometimes, yeah, but I don't know what you're referring to.
There's a character named Nelson. He keeps failing school, and so he's like whatever, an 18-year-old kid in like fourth grade or something.
Well, let me tell you about it. I could barely fit in those second grade tables.
Wow, I can't imagine.
But here's the interesting story about this. Those 2 weeks when the French language teacher was not there, my dad and my sister were prepping me day and night, trying to teach me everything they can to get to a point where the teacher would be kind of full enough to accept me in the classroom with all the challenges that it represents. If I can just convince her that I know a bit of French, that I'm not like completely starting from zero. So I was getting, French lessons nonstop for those 2 weeks at home, with the idea of the first meeting with the teacher, I would actually go in and talk to her in French, because in Tunisia, foreign language teachers, even though they're Tunisians, they would never speak to their students in Arabic. They always speak to their students in the language that they teach. And this is true throughout. So the expectation was on day one, the teacher was going to see me and ask me my name and ask me where I was from. And the whole conversation was going to happen in French. So my dad and my sister were prepping me for that conversation to go in and be able to answer, my name and my age and my grade and where I came from, like basic conversation stuff. And this way she would not, object to the idea of having this kid that needs all of this remediation work in her classroom. So, and in those 2 weeks, I was ready and practiced the whole thing. I know how to answer, give my name and my age and basic conversation with the teacher. And I was going into the classroom ready to have that conversation. There was, no problem whatsoever. Okay. So as soon as I walk in and she calls my name and calls me to her desk, and then she looks at me straight in the eye and starts to asking me, "What's your name? Where are you from?" And I froze. I started. I knew all the answers, but I was like, "I'm not going to lie to this lady. This is a very serious situation." So I started speaking to her in Arabic. I told her, "Listen, I'm sorry. I know how to answer. I know exactly what you're asking me, and I can, fool you and give you the answers, the prepackaged answers that I memorized. But let me tell you the situation. I know nothing." And she freaked out.
Oh, she freaked out. Really?
She was like, "This can't be happening." She took me by the arm and said, "Let's go to the principal's office right now." And she made a big scene. She was like, "I'm not having this kid in my classroom. He's way behind. He needs to be in second grade."
Oh.
And my parents were like, "What happened? We prepared you for this thing." I told them, "Yeah, but I'm not going to lie to the lady. Look at the situation. After all, I mean, she's right."
Wow. I was honestly thinking that was kind of a mature thing for a 9-year-old to do, to admit so candidly and.
Well, it was a big lie. It was like one of the biggest lies of my life. Is to fool this person that I in 2 weeks I somehow made up 3.5 years worth of French.
So what happened?
So anyway, it was a big situation, and then of course the principal intervened, and my parents and so on, and they finally convinced her. They told her, "Listen, there's 3.5 or maybe 4 months left in the academic year." They convinced her that I'll manage the Arabic portion of the curriculum well enough to pass. I just need remediation work to catch up on the French side of things. So she agreed to have me both in the 5th grade with my classmates, but also do the full remainder of the year with the second graders, the beginners. And the second graders were already ahead of me because they already had, several months, like a trimester and a half worth of French that I didn't have. But of course, I mean, I could write the alphabet, I could, do things, but they were still learning like how to write the French. So it was pretty, challenging. So that's where I could barely fit in those second grade desks. And of course, it was such an awkward situation for this big kid, 9-year-old kid, sitting in the classroom with the little ones. But anyway, long story short, it was a lot of work, obviously there, a lot of work at home with my parents helping me and tutoring and all that. And in the 5th grade class, one of the biggest things that students are taught at that level is dictation, like knowing how to spell, long sentences, complicated vocabulary, and things like that. And there's a segment in class, an exam portion called like self-dictation, where you literally memorize like a whole poem or a whole paragraph or something like that. Mm. And you walk in the classroom with no notes, and you sit down and write it, and you're supposed to not only memorize the text, but also spell the whole thing correctly. So I go into the classroom and one of those days, and we have our assignment, and the teacher says, go ahead, start your dictation exercise. And I did the whole thing, studied for it and everything. And then the way we're supposed to check our work is I hand my assignment to my classmate next to me, and he hands his assignment to me, and we're supposed to check the spelling and everything, kind of do the correction and then show it to the teacher. And of course, the teacher put me right next to the top student in the classroom with the idea that it will rub on me somehow, mm-hmm. that it'll be kind of in good behavior or whatever. So it was fine. So he checks my work, and he tells the teacher it's a perfect score. There's not a single spelling mistake. And she looked at me and she was like, this can't be right. You must have cheated. Mm-hmm. And I told her, I can do it again if you want in front of you. So she told me, no, go to the board. And she started dictating things left and right from that exercise, from other things we studied before. And I started spelling the whole thing, probably almost correctly, the whole thing, maybe made like one or small. And she could not believe that the kid who didn't know anything in French just 2 months ago was able to catch up and outperform, the students in fifth grade. So that was kind of a great moment of victory. And I became her favorite student, and, a wonderful story. I mean, I was terrified of that teacher for the first few weeks because of the initial reaction and the whole situation. Mm-hmm. And it ended up being a sweet kind of closure to that thing. And I still remember that teacher to this day. I mean, it was intense but wonderful life experience in her classroom.
Wow. Okay. Because when you said that you sat next to the best student and you went up to the board, I got confused and I thought you were talking about the second grade for a minute. But then,
no, this is the fifth grade class. Yeah.
That changed the story when I understood that. My first question, and this is kind of leading to a broader question of just kind of your memories of all of these things as a 9-year-old. What was your relationship, if you remember, with the second graders during those several months?
It started as an awkward situation. People were confused. I mean, the other kids were confused. But then, I mean, they understood that I came from a foreign country, that I never studied French. So as the whole school knew me as the foreigner, as the kid from Saudi Arabia. So that even though I was Tunisian, but because I came from that educational system and had to be put into the situation, I was always viewed as the foreigner, right? As the immigrant in my own country. Mm-hmm. And of course, when I was in Saudi Arabia, I was also the immigrant in the country in which I was born and my family was from, and so on. So I was always an immigrant. And then later in my life, I came to the US, and of course I'm an immigrant. Now I'm a US citizen, but I'm still an immigrant everywhere I go. Wow. So that's something that was with me from birth, basically. And of course, I also had a slight accent. When I was in Saudi Arabia, I had a slight accent because I was half Tunisian. And when I moved to Tunisia, having lived so long in Saudi Arabia, I definitely had a Saudi accent. And it took a while to get rid of it, obviously. And that, of course, becomes your identity when the kids know you, the kid with the accent who, is behind in French and all that. Mm-hmm. So it creates this situation of, being viewed as the other, as the foreigner, and so on. And it, in some cases, it involves bullying and everything. But there is never anything that would, resemble the bullying cases that we hear about and all that. but it was, I was also the cool kid in a way who managed all of these challenges and made some wonderful friends. Some of my classmates from that fifth grade class are still my best friends to this day.
Well, okay. So in the U.S., it's the educational system, the lower educational system, grade schools is different. So like you were just talking about a teacher who has fifth grade classes and second grade classes,
Yeah.
and that's pretty unusual here. Like my wife is a second grade teacher.
Yeah.
She's just a second grade teacher. Period. So in that situation in the U.S. in public schools, second graders spend the whole day together. They go to recess together. They go to lunch together. They go to specials together. So I'm guessing that you didn't have as much of an opportunity to do like recess and secondary things with those second graders. Because I was thinking of
no, not
did
at
you
all.
become a big brother with that, like kind of a big brother figure or something like that? But I guess it was
not at all. It was like in and out, and I was, if anything, I was more connected to my fifth grade classmates. So in Tunisia, Tunisia is a developing country, and became independent in mid 1950s, and it sort of was way behind in terms of educational infrastructure, given the size of the population and so on. So the country was built on very limited educational resources, and the educational system carries that tradition pretty much to this day, even though now the situation is much better. So every school building would have two shifts of cohorts. So there's like a fifth grade group A, fifth grade group B, and the teacher is with both. So I was in group A, which started school at 7:30 a.m. and it goes until 10 a.m. That's the Arabic section, which includes science and math, and all the other subjects are in Arabic in grade school. And then you leave at 10 and come back at 12:30 afternoon and do the French section from 12:30 to 3 p.m.
Okay.
The other kids in group B, they start their day at 10. 10 to 12:30, do their Arabic stuff, and then they go home for lunch, and then they come back in the afternoon from 3 to 5:30 p.m. for their French lessons. And
that's intense for the teachers.
So pretty much it is a full day using the classroom space, but it's like the size of the school is doubled when you have two shifts, basically.
Sure.
So the French teachers either teach two sections of the fifth grade, for example, or one section of the fifth grade and one section of the second grade. It depends on the teacher's assignment. But they're pretty much there all day, doing different groups and things like that.
What was the general size of the school building? Was it like more like a schoolhouse or more like a U.S.?
Oh, in my case, it was a big school because it was in the capital city. It was one of the big schools. So it was probably, 2,000 to 3,000 students. I'm guessing.
Wow.
It was
That's
big.
huge.
Yeah. And it was adjacent to the middle school and high school buildings of the same school. So it was literally right next door. When I finished from the grade school, I transitioned to the middle and high school next door.
Wow. Okay.
I don't remember the exact numbers of students, but it was big.
That's very big. That's unusually big for a grade school, especially. You mentioned your sister and your father tutored you. How old is your sister?
My sister is 3 years older than me, and she grew up in Tunisia with my Tunisian grandparents. So she never entered the Saudi school system because she was already in Tunisia and plugged into the school system. So even though my father and mother were in Saudi Arabia at the time with me, my sister we would see her during vacations and things like that. So she was in the Tunisian school system with French and everything. So she was able to help me transition to learning French and everything.
Wow. So you were born in Saudi Arabia. Your father was working there. What's the point of such a restrictive stance on immigration? What's the point of that? Like, what's the goal, or what's the benefit to Saudi Arabia of that?
Well, I mean, you sort of the intensity of immigration laws in different countries is kind of on a spectrum, right? And but they all of these restrictions on immigration have the same intention after all, which is to minimize immigration and to keep wages down and to make sure that the workers know their place in the system, that the citizens are the bosses and the immigrants are the workers, and this applies no matter what level of education or position. I mean, my father wasn't doing
Oh,
manual work. My father was, had a master's degree, had experience in business. My father speaks 4 languages, is skilled worker, right? It's not like my father was begging for, manual low paid job. He was a manager. And yet, manager, teacher, farm worker, restaurant worker, doesn't matter. It's all immigrants, and the boss is the citizen. The immigrants are supposed to work there, get paid less than nationals, and the pay scale gap, by the way, is still true to this day, not just in Saudi Arabia, but in many other countries. So that is the default setting for an immigration system. And you have to remember that Saudi Arabia was a poor country prior to the 1970s, and then transitioned into a massively wealthy country that didn't have a skilled labor force, and transitioned into needing to have millions of expat workers coming in to build the infrastructure and to staff the hotels and restaurants and shops and so on. And the Saudi population benefited from that wealth explosion that meant massive government subsidies for education and welfare services and all kinds of things. So there was no need, especially at the time with a relatively small population, there was no need to have Saudis actually do the work, especially manual work and kind of things like that. So you could import workers, expats, to do that work. And the Saudi citizens can be the owners of businesses and companies and kind of collect profits from that process. So it created a very hierarchical system that was also, divided based on citizenship, race and ethnicity, and so on. So all of those layers are part of that process. And you fast forward to this day, those things backfire because now the situation is very different. Even though Saudi Arabia is still technically a wealthy country, but it's a country now that has a larger population, a larger youth population, and youth population that is highly educated, increasingly more educated, but now is finding it challenging to compete in the labor market with foreign workers who are underpaid, who work longer hours, and who are massively overqualified in many cases. So let's say you're a college graduate in Saudi Arabia with a degree in marketing or accounting or whatever it is, and you're looking for a job, and now you're competing with, say, a Tunisian worker or an Egyptian worker who has 10 years worth of experience in accounting, is willing to work for a relatively lower wage compared to what Saudis expect. That worker also happens to speak 3 or 4 foreign languages and is willing to work beyond the 9 to 5 hours if you make them. Now, if you're a Saudi citizen, you have the education, but you just finished school, right? So you don't have the 10-year experience. You don't speak those 3 or 4 foreign languages, especially if you're working in a company that does a lot of international business. And you expect to work a 9 to 5 job and no weekends and no evenings, and you expect the benefits that come with the job. So that makes it, and the pay scale being biased against immigrants. If you're the employer, who are you going to hire? The Saudi graduate or the Egyptian or Tunisian person with 10 years of experience and all that, and you pay them less, and they'll work harder, right? So it created this situation whereby this dual kind of labor market makes it extremely difficult for young Saudis to actually enter the labor market. Now, it's not a problem if you come from a wealthy family, but the majority of youth in Saudi Arabia these days don't come from wealthy families. They come from middle class families, working class families, let alone poor families in some cases, and that means they end up unemployed for a long time, and that creates obviously an economic problem, a social problem. Because if you don't have a job, you can't start a family, you can't buy a house, you can't, leads to other problems, obviously. And that means the government has to step in and increase welfare subsidies for unemployed families and so on. And that doesn't solve the problem. That's like a UBI, right? It's just postponing the problem. The roots of the problem require a much more fair and equitable labor market system whereby labor laws apply to everybody, right? 9-to-5 job means 9-to-5 job.
It sounds like that's more like the U.S. part. I presume, I can only guess. I can't imagine this has to be right. That the immigrant stole my job, right? That's where they focus their energy on the immigrant stole my job rather than on the system that allows CEOs to do that. So I wonder, and I'm sure your father knew that Saudi Arabia was like this, and yet he chose to go there with all these restrictions and low wages and so on. So I wonder why he chose to go there and do this, knowing that it was a pretty draconian system.
Well, it was sort of not his choice because my father went to school there. So you have to remember that Saudi Arabia is like a hub in the Middle East when it comes to religious activity because of Mecca and Medina and so on. So my dad's parents, who were very religious, actually packed up and moved the whole family when they were right after the kids finished high school and moved them there to go to university there. So my father ended up studying both business and Islamic studies in Saudi Arabia as a college kid, and ended up during the high season of pilgrimage, sort of volunteering as a medic with the pilgrims season, basically during his college years. So my dad's family already lived there most of the year, even though my grandfather was still sort of commuting, going back to Tunisia to finish, because he was an employee. His job was in Tunisia, but was commuting back and forth to kind of keep his career going in Tunisia, but also support his college kids now in Saudi Arabia, my dad and my uncle. So that's how my dad met my mother and ended up getting married and staying there. So it wasn't like a decision to move for jobs. He was already studying there and so on. But he was studying there as a foreigner. He was working there as a foreigner. So there's no such thing as a path to citizenship for foreigners.
I was just thinking that, yeah. Okay.
It was always with the expectation you either have a work permit with a Saudi business and you stay, and the day your work permit is done or you're fired, you can't even transfer to another employer. You have to leave the country and then hope that some other employer will recruit you again, which is typically very, very difficult.
Okay. I'd like to go back to the drama of basically it seems like Saudi Arabia was shamed into letting you go. That the publicity, the bad publicity, they just allowed you to go to Tunisia. That's what it seems like. And I wonder of your memory of the drama, the political drama, and being in the media, and what was your memory of that as a 9-year-old? Well,
it was sort of strange to see your name, or at least your initials, in the newspaper, because they, to protect your identity, they wouldn't spell out your whole name and everything. But part of the media strategy was actually my parents' way of trying to raise the profile of the case to a diplomatic level, because otherwise there is nothing you can do to to get my passport. Which is why, by the way, to this day, that particular employer still has my passport locked in a vault or somewhere. Which is meaningless, because eventually I ended up getting a Tunisian passport. I actually couldn't get a Tunisian passport until I was ready to go to college, to go to grad school in the US. I never left the country, was never allowed to have a passport, because at the time, a passport is a very, losing your passport, legally speaking, the passport is the property of the Tunisian government, and they just give it to you to travel with. You're not supposed to lose it.
Oh, never thought of it that way.
At the time, things are different, I guess, now, but at the time, there was quite a bit of trafficking in passports, because they have like security features and whatever, and people steal them and, insert different pictures on them and use them for, all kinds of illicit activity. So losing your passport was, I think it might have been considered like losing your privilege to travel again. So it took a lot of work with the Tunisian government for years to accept the fact that they should give me a new passport to travel, to go to college, to go to grad school. And it took more than a decade worth of trying with the Tunisian government to get a passport. And eventually I got it, I think, just a few months before going to Kansas City. Until the last minute, like I didn't know if I was actually ever allowed to leave the country.
Did it delay your plans?
No, it didn't, but it took a long time. Because every time I apply, they say, well, where's your other passport? And I say, well, it was, tell the whole story. There was a whole thing. And of course, after more than a decade, nobody remembers what was the original case or what was the situation. They just know you lost your passport, basically. So you're not allowed to have another passport.
Wow.
So it took, I think what convinced them eventually to give me a passport was the fact that I already graduated college in Tunisia. I was unemployed, and I had this admission letter from graduate school in the US. And they had two choices: accept me as unemployed in Tunisia or let me go somewhere else. And they pretty much always choose to let you go.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's one less person to worry about in the country. That's how they see it.
Okay.
There was actually an official government strategy to deal with youth unemployment in Tunisia. When I was finishing college, the government put out like a whole strategy, 42 different things that the government was doing to reduce youth unemployment. None of which was direct employment, but all of which was
make people disappear, basically.
Supporting entrepreneurs, giving them micro credits, start your own business, all kinds of kind of entrepreneurship type of things. And then one of those strategies was supporting young people to find employment abroad. That was an official government strategy, is to take, people you, as a government, spent so much money and effort to educate, to produce, doctors and engineers and teachers and technicians and all that, and help them find a job somewhere else. That is called brain drain, with full support of the government. And just to illustrate how bad the situation is today with the pandemic, the how do we call the guys who do anesthesia before surgery? What's their
anesthesiologists?
Anesthesiologists. Today, Tunisia, we have more Tunisian anesthesiologists working in France at this point during the pandemic than anesthesiologists working in Tunisia. And thousands of doctors, engineers, medical technicians have left the country because of austerity, because of unemployment, because of so many difficulties they face. And these are all young people, the majority of very young people.
Well, we're going to come back to this. We're going to come back to this, your wheelhouse at the end of, colonial. But just a kind of what you just said, how does that fit into your work? And what I mean by that is is basically disappearing people out of the country, just ejecting people out of the country. Is that part of the picture of, colonialization of is that kind of encouraged in a way by the more powerful countries to just, get rid of your smartest citizens because we don't want you to make, high value products, basically?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the time, so the reason I mentioned this, because at the time I didn't understand this in a colonial and post-colonial context. I didn't understand like the macro economics of it the way you hear me discuss it today.
Actually, let me interrupt you just for a moment.
Sure.
And actually, what it makes me think of is those people, are high value products. And so they want you to they want those countries, those developing countries, to get rid of the good people. Let us have your good people.
Well, sure, but again, at the time I didn't see it this way. But thinking back on my personal experience, my own friends, my own family members, including my father and their professional journey and immigration journey, it's all part of this extractive system that we literally lived in and experienced and continue to experience to this day. So it was. Of course, you think critically about it at that time, and you realize, well, this is not benefiting Tunisia. This is benefiting, the global North and so on. But you don't put all the pieces of the puzzle together. And I think this is kind of the privilege I have today as an academic who spent quite a bit of time thinking about this and connecting the dots between theory and practice. It kind of makes me double my efforts in trying to provide this analytical explanation and the logical policy kind of consequences that must come out of this analysis. Try to share this with as many policymakers, as many engaged citizens, as many activists and organizers, so we can, tackle the root causes of these problems. So that, only thinking back on those experiences now allows me to kind of see more clearly how I came to this particular path of research and policy work.
Okay.
It didn't happen by accident, in other words. I lived it and kind of struggled to understand it, make sense of it. And I'm in this privileged situation now where I can put these things together and understand exactly what happened to most of my friends, myself, my family, and so on.
That's interesting. So this experience you're telling us about was your kind of catalyst to your work,
Sure. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was constantly drawn to these questions and these issues, in terms of my academic interests.
Okay. Okay, so let's do two more personal things, and let's start getting into academic stuff. Basically, I mean, it's kind of very drastically switching gears. Being a parent, in having all the experiences that you've gone through, and I'd like to transition into music. And I'm wondering if music is part of being a parent at all. And I know that's kind of. I was hoping it would fit in a little more smoothly. I can't quite think of a smooth transition, but then I'd like to talk about the music and focus on Bob Marley. And so,
oh, sure.
You can kind of start wherever you think is appropriate, and then I can.
Sure. Well, as a parent, you start a whole new journey, kind of dealing directly with your children and their needs and thinking about their future and, trying to do the best you can to give them the best quality of life and education and experience. And you start thinking of them not just obviously as human beings you need to take care of physically, but their mental well-being, what they're thinking, the experiences they have. This is a whole other thing. And that naturally makes you reflect on your own childhood and experience and upbringing. And you start recognizing how much work must have gone into, taking care of you. And that means the parents and grandparents and all the struggles they had to deal with. Mm-hmm. But as I mentioned earlier, as an immigrant, you also deal with a whole other set of issues with parenting and with identity, with language, that on the one hand, my kids are Americans, they're born and raised here. On the other hand, they're also Arab Americans, and they have a complex identity linguistically and in terms of religion and tradition, and they fit in, and they try to fit in these two separate worlds. And one of those worlds is mine, and they're not fully in it because they didn't live in the Middle East. I mean, they traveled a little bit as children, but this is the world they know. It's the United States. This is their country, their place. But somehow they need to interface with the world of their parents
If I
and
may
grandparents.
If I may ask, where did you meet your wife? Did you meet her in the United States?
Yeah, my wife is Arab American. So we met here in the United States. She was born and raised in the U.S., but also from an Arab immigrant family. So she has, to some extent, similar experience, probably closer experience to our children, because they were born and raised here, like their mom. My experience is probably closer to her parents' experience, who came as immigrants in the U.S. So it's a very interesting. So I rely a lot on my wife in these situations for dealing with the kids' experience, because she lived that experience as the daughter of immigrants.
Sure.
But as an American citizen, was born and raised here, but belongs to these two separate worlds. The physical world in which they live, which is the United States, but the cultural diaspora of the immigrant family that happens to be her parents. And it's challenging for the parents, because it's very hard to understand that your kids don't know your world. They just hear about it or see some of the cultural effects of it, but that's very tangential to their reality here. And that's very challenging for little ones to understand and reconcile. And that's why it requires quite a bit of attention to allow those two worlds to fuse together in a smooth way, non-alienating way, and then to take that identity and share it with their friends and their world in a way that makes them feel proud and makes them feel, comfortable in their own skin as the people that they're going to grow up to be. So that's something that is very kind of constant on our minds, and it starts with the littlest things, as little interactions with other kids on the playground or at school or birthday parties, tiny little things, and little kids don't really know, especially when they're first starting to speak, they don't know that they're actually speaking half Arabic and half English. They just know that this is the language they speak at home. So they assume that other kids will understand it, which creates for some fun situations, of course, at early age. But when they're a little older, of course, they start to recognize that these are different languages, and there's certain words you can speak to your American friends that they will not understand, right?
I have a very brief story about my kid that you just reminded me of. So when we registered my older son for, I think it was kindergarten, we took him to the school, and they did do a little, the teacher talks with him and in private, just to kind of get a sense of his level. And the teacher comes out and she asks us, does your son have the same last name as you? And we're like, what? And and it turned out that she said, what's your name? And he said, Jacob. And then she said, what's your last name? And I don't remember exactly the sequence. I kind of forgot, but she said, what's your name? And he said, Super Herbie. And what, am I wrong? Tell me quick. Anyway, his nickname is Super Herbie. And so she asked him his name, and somehow he said Super Herbie, but I think my real name is Super Herbie, or something like that. And so we had to teach him, that's just private, that's just a private joke between us. And he actually went out in the world thinking that his secret name or his real name was Super Herbie. So anyway,
absolutely.
So can you give a sense of how, I mean, you obviously you want your kids to understand your experience in the experience of an immigrant, and they don't have some of the difficulties that you experienced and their grandparents experienced. So how do you communicate or share with or tell stories to or whatever it is? How do you get your kids to learn that more clearly?
Well, language is obviously a key component of that, but it's challenging, to do this, especially because my wife and I don't speak the same dialect. We both speak Arabic, but they're different dialects. So we ended up from the beginning of our relationship just speaking English because it's just more convenient. So we ended up agreeing to use my wife's dialect as the language of instruction for the kids because it's easier.
Where's her dialect from?
She's Palestinian, Jordanian. Dialect is much easier than the North African dialects. So that's the Arabic that the kids know the most. But they're a little older, so they're starting to learn that there are actually different dialects, and they're listening to quite a bit of Tunisian music and things like that. So they're learning different words, but we still use the kind of Levantian dialect and accent at home,
Okay.
which is fine with me because I'm sort of used to it. Because I also learned different dialects early on. I lived in Saudi Arabia and have family members from different parts of the region, so I'm comfortable with different dialects. But it just doesn't come naturally, like for day-to-day conversations. It's kind of, you have to make the effort to to speak a different dialect, and at the same
Mm-hmm.
time you live in an English speaking world 24/7.
Yeah.
So the kids ended up picking up English as the main language at home, with quite a bit of Arabic infused. And the older they get, the more easily we can kind of introduce more Arabic. So that's language. The other thing is music, and my kind of best form of therapy and and entertainment for me is music. So I listen to a lot of music, and of course I introduce the kids to that. And I'm very eclectic in my musical choices. So everything from Metallica to Bob Marley to
Oh, wow. Okay.
Tunisian rap to folk music, Middle Eastern folk music, all kinds of things. So I sort of made me kind of shift my day-to-day musical tastes to try to draw them to as much Arabic music that it would expose them to not just the sounds and all that, but also to the language. And what made me discover this kind of more intensely was I had some Arabic classical music playing on TV.
Actually, Fadel, if I
Yeah,
if I may,
sure,
I want to go into music.
sure,
I have a follow-up question from what you were talking about previous, if I may.
sure.
So you remember what you were just about to say, please,
Yeah, I
so we
will.
can go right back to that. Okay, good. First, how old are your kids?
At this point, my kids are 7.5, 5.5, and 2.5.
Okay.
Three
Okay.
boys.
Wow, three boys. Okay, I have 12 and 15. Was there a community of people for them to speak your wife's dialect with outside of your home?
Other than their grandparents, very little. I mean,
Very
they're
little.
kind of my wife's family is nearby, but not. It's not like intense. When I say nearby, like 2 hours away. So it's
Okay.
not like something that they're exposed to on a day-to-day basis. So that makes it more challenging, obviously.
Okay. Okay. So you basically are choosing to keep your language alive with your kids.
Yeah, yeah. It's you have to intentionally try to do that. Otherwise, it just disappears.
Yeah,
And of
I
course,
hear.
when you lose the language, you lose everything else that comes with it.
Ray, you're reminding me. I believe this is correct that Israel actually brought Hebrew back to life, back from the dead, for somehow that I believe that's correct. Okay, so music. Can you go back to? Can you go back to what you were saying regarding music?
Sure. So the kids obviously kind of are attracted first to the tunes if they find them interesting and so on, and then they become curious about the words, the lyrics, and what's the meaning of this song. So they started constantly asking questions. What does it mean? What is the song about? And of course, you can't explain the whole song, but you pick like some keywords that you want them to learn, and you kind of engage in conversations with them. And they pick it up pretty quickly. They start, singing with the tune, and then they start using that word in an English sentence to substitute for the English word, and they start playing around with the vocabulary. So that was the case with the two older kids to some extent. It was sort of working, but then the 2-year-old. One day I was playing classical music on TV, and he just stood there and was mesmerized. Stood there for 15 minutes. I mean, classical songs are long. And he thought it was the most beautiful thing he's ever heard.
Wow.
And it's just unusual for children to be attracted to classical music. So I noticed that and was like, he doesn't sit in front of a screen for more than 30 seconds, no matter what's on TV. He was completely mesmerized by that. And so was
the video of the orchestra on the screen or just the audio?
Yeah, the orchestra and the singer. It was an Kulthum classical song, but it was performed recently with a new orchestra. And actually, it's an Arab American orchestra from Michigan and an Egyptian singer, opera singer, you could say. So he was just mesmerized by the whole thing. So we started playing more of those videos from the same orchestra, and he just loved it. And because of his kind of fascination with that particular type of music, his older brothers started getting interested in it too. And it became sort of a family thing. We now listen. And it was interesting. It started with classical music, but him discovering that it's another language, him discovering that he can translate the meaning of a word from Arabic to English. It was like a whole world of discovery for him. And he started asking, what is this song about? What does it mean? For a 2-year-old, it's fascinating. So, and because of that whole experience, now his older brothers are so much more into it than they would have been otherwise. And it's interesting. He started with classical music, and now he's into any kind of Arabic music. We listen to, hip hop and pop music and everything. So now he's into the tunes, but classical music is always his thing. Like in the car, at home, when he wants to listen to music, we say, "Can we put?" Yeah, yeah. So. And it's interesting. I mean, I was never like that deep into Arabic classical music until very recently in my life. It's something that usually older adults appreciate more. and so that's what makes it very fascinating. So that, they started asking about musical instruments. So we have a few musical instruments at home for them to play with, and hopefully at some point to learn more thoroughly, which is something that I never experienced. We didn't have any musical instruments or music classes, music lessons and things like that. Even though I was very musical from an early age, but we never had the opportunity to be exposed to it or practice it and things like that for a variety of reasons. So that's something that's kind of makes me happy that, we have this new family thing going that's probably gonna draw the kids a bit more to our culture, and they're very they share this proudly with their playmates and with their friends, and they even try to play these songs for them and of course the other kids are like, well, what are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense.
Have you taken your boys to a concert, an orchestral concert?
Well, this discovery happened during the pandemic.
There you go.
So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to do that with them, and I'm hoping As soon as the National Arab American Orchestra starts having concerts again, hopefully we'll get the opportunity to make a family trip out of it, either in Michigan, or they play in different parts of the country too. That will be
Today I talk with Fadhel Kaboub about his personal story. His childhood in Saudi Arabia and Tunisia, being a parent, his love of music, and how music has become part of his parenting. Fadhel is an economics professor at Denison University in Granville, Ohio, and the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, an interdisciplinary public policy think tank. The focus of his academic work is on how the lens of MMT can inform developing nations, which we talk about in the second half of Part 2. I've written a post filled with links to Fadhel's papers, posts, and appearances, a link to which you can find in the show notes. Today's story begins with a 9-year-old Fadhel at the center of a political drama between his two home countries of Saudi Arabia and Tunisia. When his grandparents in Tunisia fell ill, his father rushed home from his job in Saudi Arabia to take care of them. Saudi Arabia's immigration laws require foreign workers to give their employers not only their own passport, but also the passports of all their children. Unfortunately, when Fadhel's father left for Tunisia, the employer decided not to release Fadhel's passport, essentially holding the 9-year-old hostage. His family leveraged the media to shame Saudi Arabia into allowing the little boy to be reunited with his family. To this day, Fadhel has never seen his original passport. We then turn to the story of how Fadhel joined the 5th grade in Tunisia with children who had a 3.5-year head start in learning French. This is the language spoken during half of the instruction time in the country. The overriding theme of Fadhel's story, however, is how there is no place on earth where he is not considered an outsider or immigrant. Babies born in Saudi Arabia are only considered citizens if their father is a Saudi citizen. Fadhel's mother was a citizen, but his father was Tunisian. When he moved to Tunisia, he had a Saudi accent and was unable to speak French. And now, even though a U.S. citizen, he remains an immigrant. The experience, plus witnessing the experience of his parents and home countries, has greatly influenced and inspired not only his academic work, but also his decisions as the parent of 3 little boys. This podcast, Activist MMT, is dedicated half to academic concepts and half to the personal stories of how people, both lay people and academics, came to MMT and how it changed them. The reason I believe these personal stories are so important is because it's not possible to separate the academic concepts from those who develop and promote them. This includes their personal stories, what they care about, and how they choose to use the power they have or don't have. The idea was primarily inspired by Fred Lee in his 2006 book, A History of Heterodox Economics, which was recommended to me by Nathan Tankis. Neoclassical economics would have you focus only on their maths and models and not the discriminatory behavior of universities and journals, and those that back those universities, journals, and their economists. They would prefer you not look at any other discipline, such as history, culture, sociology, institutions, and especially politics. The entire neoliberal project would have you focus only on the how are you going to pay for it question, and not the minor inconvenience of having to change the very foundation of human society if we are not to go extinct in the coming decades. I talk much more about this concept of interdisciplinarity in my introduction to episode 81 with Richard Ty. But for now, on to my conversation with Fadhel Kaboub. This is part 1 of a 2-part conversation. Enjoy.